So before I talked about how we're going to need models to help structure how data will be flowing through our application, and a data transfer object, or DTO for short, will help us with that. So a data transfer object, or DTO for short, will take the information that a user sent in the request, place it in a structure to be utilized throughout the application. So the first DTO that we're going to create is a sign up DTO, which is going to allow us to take a request from the user, put it in a sign up DTO to make sure that the data is in a format that we're expecting and we receive the data that we're expecting. And then it's going to allow us to place that data into our user table when it's time to create the user entity, which will be coming soon. But the sign up DTO is going to be first important to make sure that we receive the data in the format that we expect, and it's going to allow us to do some validation to make sure that the data is what we are expecting, right? We got to make sure that the age is a number. We got to make sure that the email is in the proper format. And we're going to be utilizing a dependency that Spring has to make sure that we provide some rules for validation. Because if the user doesn't provide the data in a structure that we're expecting, then instead of processing that request, we're going to inform them that, okay, this data is messed up. You have to resend that in a format that we expect, or we'll never process that request. So we'll be utilizing a dependency called Springboot starter validation, and we're going to need to place that into our pom.xml. So let me show you guys that real quick. So go into the pom.xml and try to find a spot that makes sense in this pom.xml. Usually I try to place it in a spot like right before the Spring Boot starter test. So I'm gonna place it right here and they paste this in. So this is what I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using the dependency of, and it's going to be within the group ID of org.springframework.boots, and the artifact ID is going to be Spring Boot starter validation. So this is going to help us create some validation rules for our sign up DTO, or for our future DTOs in general, to make sure that each field is data that we expect. And if it's not, then we're going to send a message back to the user that this data is not good. Now, when you add a dependency to a pom.xml, you got to make sure that you refresh the pom.xml to make sure that it retrieves that dependency. So usually you'll see like a little refresh button here to load the Maven changes. So I'm going to click that, and I'm going to allow it to retrieve that dependency in my project. All right, so once the loading is done, we know that it's finished making those changes or adding those changes. And now what I want to do is I want to right click on models, and I want to create a new Kotlin class / file, and I'm going to call this sign up DTO. And I'm going to be utilizing a Kotlin data class because the data class is perfect, right? Its main purpose is to store data. That's why it's called a data class, right? Its main purpose is to hold data, and it automatically comes with additional member functions like line copy, component end, which will help with destructuring properties of an object. So I'll definitely check out data classes if you need more information on what it is. But this is the main purpose of a data class, is storing data. So it's perfect for the case of a DTO. So press enter, and it should create it for us right here. So what's the purpose of a sign up DTO? Well, it's properties that we'll expect from the user to send during the sign up process. And we're going to utilize validation to get it in the format that we expect. So now let me paste in some comments here just to make it quicker and easier to understand of some of the validation rules that we'll be utilizing in this DTO. So with that validation dependency that we imported, we'll be able to use some annotations to help validate the properties that we'll be creating in the sign up DTO. So we have the @not_null, which, as the name implies, we don't want null values. We have @not_empty, which, it can't be null. It can't have a length of 0. It has to be greater than 0. We can't have blank, so meaning it's not null. And this will take the trim value, meaning that people might try to get a little bit tricky and add space at the end to make it look like it's a big string, but it's not. So this @not_blank makes sure that it receives the trim length of a string. So this is very important. There's the @size. So if you want to make sure that there's a constraint of a specific size, so if you want a username of 4 and greater, then you can use the @size annotation. And there's the @min annotation, which will provide a minimum constraint to make sure that you force the user to have a minimum value, right? And we'll be using that for the age check because we want to make sure that a user has to be at least 16 to create or to sign up for our application. So a lot of annotations that can be utilized from that validation dependency that we imported from Springboot Starter validation. And there's a lot more as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up a constructor and I'm going to start defining the properties that I want in the sign up process. So I want a user to send a request with these fields, and it has to match the validation that I'm going to place on each field. So first, I want the first name of a user, right? And that's going to be a string. And while using this validation or these validation annotations, we will have to use the um, question mark here to make sure that it's nullable. You're probably wondering, like, why would we want it to be nullable? Well, because if we don't make them nullable, then the rules would not work, right? Kind of counterintuitive, um, but that's just what occurs, right? If we don't use the um, question mark to make it nullable, then it's not going to work for some reason. But because of the rule itself, the validation rule itself, it won't get passed if it's null anyway. So there's still some level of protection there. So if you want to test for yourself to see if it would work, because I already did, you can. Just if you don't believe me, you can try. But um, in my case, you have to make it nullable. But we will have annotations to make sure that it's not null or it won't go through if it's null anyway. So you should be fine. The next thing I expect is the last name, right? So I expect first name and last name, and it's also going to be a string. I expect an email, so that's going to be a type string as well, and that has to be nullable. And I forgot a comma here. The next thing is going to be password, right? And that's going to be a type string. And the last thing is going to be age, and that will be an int. And we don't really have to make that nullable because by default it's going to be 0 anyway. So, but we're going to end up, using the validation rule to make sure that the user is at least 16 years old. So now that we have the properties that we expect during sign up, we can go ahead and start adding those validation rules to make sure that we don't let data that we don't want to be passed through to our endpoints to be processed. Because with these validation rules, it's gonna stop the user before it even gets to the processing part, right? It's gonna return a bad request. That's what we expect. So to add the validations, what you're gonna have to do is, so to add the validation, what you're gonna have to do is utilize more annotation. So it's gonna be at field, and what we're gonna do is not blank for the first one. And what I'm gonna put, and what you could do, and I gotta import it. So this is gonna come from the dependency that I imported. It's gonna come from Jakarta.validation.constraints. I hope I pronounced that properly, but that's coming from the dependency that we installed. And what we can do here is, if for some reason the user did provide a blank value, meaning that it is null, or that it is, at the trim length, meaning that they try to put a whole bunch of spaces, but with this validation is going to trim it, meaning it's going to get rid of the spaces, and it's equal to 0, the length of the value is equal to 0, then we can return a message, and we can define the message that we're going to return to the user by doing first name can not be null and must have greater length than 0. So this will return if the user tries to send a blank value. Now you're probably wondering why we're using the at field and a colon. Well, we have to use the at field and a colon because we're using a data class. If we're using a class, the at annotation will be just fine, just like as you see here, with the name of the constraint. So if it's an at not null, at not empty, then that's fine if we're just using a regular class. But since we're using a data class, the at field colon and the name of the constraints we'll have to use instead. Now, to save some time, let me just copy the at. This is the pattern pretty much. Let me just copy the prefix, and then I can add the constraint afterwards to save time. So at field colon not empty, and then after I do a couple, then I'll go ahead and copy and paste other just to save time. But it'll be message is equal to first name cannot be empty. So we have one for trim values and we have one for making sure that it is not empty. So making sure that it is not empty and not blank. So it's going to make sure that even with the trim length that it's, it has to be greater than 0 and it cannot be null. So we have validation for both. Honestly, you could probably get away with just one. Now for the last name, I'm going to place these two annotations of not blank and empty, but just naming or changing the message to last name instead of first name. Then for email, same thing of not blank and not empty. And there could even be some validation based on the structure of the email as well. That can be done as well. And then for password, I'm using not blank, not empty, but I'm also going to be using size, right? That's important. Making sure that there's a minimum of 4. Honestly, some can be 8. It's really dependent on you. But just for testing purposes, I'm going to put 4, and the max value I'll put 64. You can even double it, triple it if you want to. But it's really up to you, right? With size, you can define a minimum value and you can define a maximum length. I mean, it's not value, but length. So it could be a minimum of the length of 4 and the maximum of 64, but you can change it to fit what you want. And you can provide a message to let the user know that, it has to be between those two values. Then the last one is age. So this one is going to be using not null. So making sure that the age is not null, which in this case, it's already using a non-nullable data type, but just in case. And then there's the minimum value, which I'm importing, which pretty much set the minimum value that you're allowed for this integer, which in this case is going to be 16. Must at least be 16 to sign up for an account, right? So that's how you set one for, or constraint for an integer. You define the minimum value. And there's also a maximum value, right? So if you want to do at field max, you could do that as well. And let's be reasonable. Let's say maximum age, let's say 135, right? And we can do must be between the age of 16 to 135. Just in case somebody try to get funny and try to define something crazy, like 200 years old or something, you have a constraint for max as well. So I don't have that in this comment here, but just informs the maximum value that is allowed for a specific field, in this case, the age. So now we have a DTO on properties that we expect during sign up. So we expect the first name, last name, email, password, and an age, and we define constraints to make sure that the values are not empty, not null, that the user doesn't try to define a whole bunch of spaces. So we have not blank for that. We have the size constraint to make sure that it's specific length. We have the min and max to define the amount that is allowed to make an account. So it has to be between the ages of 16 and 135. So there's a lot of other constraints that are defined within the Jakarta validation constraints. But these are some basic validation that we can utilize to make sure that the user doesn't try to provide some crazy input. So since we created a sign up DTO, we might as well create a login DTO. So I'm going to do new Kotlin class, make sure that is a data class, login DTO, press enter. And now we can start defining the properties that we expect during login. Right? It's really personal preference, but in my case, it's going to be email and password. So in here, and let me actually open it up, do constructor, and then I'm going to do file of email string and file password string. Now here, above here, I'm going to define at constructor properties. Now let me explain why. At constructor properties is used by some serialization frameworks to associate constructor parameters with the corresponding fields and their getter and setter methods. So an email will be associated to the email variable for getters and setters, and the password will be associated to a getter and setter for password. Now, why is this needed? Because in the future, we're going to be utilizing Spring Security, and that's how it's going to inject or utilize these properties. So we have to make it a little bit different than how we created the signup DTO, because we're going to be interacting with the signup DTO while the login DTO is going to be utilizing with Spring Security, and that's how it's going to be able to access the information to place values and utilize values within this constructor. So Spring Security will be getting and setting values within here. So we'll utilize the constructor properties to help with that. And also the validation will be done by Spring Security. So no validation will be needed in this case. So the next DTO that I want to create is the funds DTO. So do new Kotlin class, data class, and it's going to be funds DTO. And the first property that I want to accept is the receiver email. This will be a string, and I am going to give it a default value of an empty string. Now, the receiver email is a property that we'll be using in cases where the user wants to send money to a user, right? So this is going to be the email of the user that will be sent the money. So kind of like Zelle or Cash App, where you can use a phone number or email, this will be the email of the user that you're sending money to. So the default value is going to be an empty string in cases where you're not sending money. Now, the main thing and the thing that's going to correlate with pretty much all transactions that we do is the amount, right? So we're going to do var amount, and this is going to be of type double. And this is not going to be nullable. It is a number, so we don't have to make it nullable. But we are going to define some validation rules for it. So it's going to be at field, and the first one we're going to define is not null, just because even though double is already not nullable, so it should break even if person tries to define a no value for it, but we want to make sure that they get a clear and concise message if they do try to send a no value. So amount needs a valid value. The next constraint that I'm going to place on this property is the min constraint, because I want to make sure that the user places a value greater than or equal to 0. I don't want any negative values that cause a lot of problems. So 0 will be the amount in this case that is the minimum value, right? So we'll need to know the account ID which we want to either deposit to or withdraw from. Remember, a user can have multiple accounts, such as multiple checking accounts or multiple saving accounts. We'll also need a from account for our logic in the future. So this will be a not null constraint for this property as well. So it's going to be var from account ID to inform where this is, being retrieved from or deposited to, right? So that's going to be of, and it's going to be type long. It's going to be at fields. And honestly, this can be a double as well, but I'm going to use long, and it's going to be not null. And I've got to put a comma here. I'm wondering why it's like not. Okay, there it is. All right. And I'm going to place a message here, and it's going to be equal to need a proper account ID. All right. So just leave a little comment here. Account to pull the money from or to place the money on, right? Meaning deposits, right? If you need to send money to another account or you need to transfer from one account internally to another account, meaning from like your checking to an internal savings account or to another internal checking account, then we're going to have another property of to account ID. So that's going to be of type long, and account to transfer to will be the comment here. So, and I also have to put a comma, right? Because I'm still in the constructor. So that's all we're going to need for the funds DTO. We're going to have a receiver emails in cases where we're going to send money to a user like Zelle or Cash App. And we have the amount property, which is going to handle deposits, withdrawals, sending, transfer. So we have to make sure that we have some validation for that to make sure it's not null and there's at least a minimum value of 0, meaning there's nothing, right? But it can be 0.01, right? If you want to use a penny, that could be plausible as well. I think you got to convert it into a long, I believe, but I could be wrong in that sense. You probably got to check the documentation for that, but 0, just to make sure that there is no negative value. And then from account ID, meaning like where are you pulling the money from, or what is the main account that you're trying to deposit the money to, right? So you got to make sure that's not null because this is going to be required for pretty much all funds related requests. So whether it's deposit, withdraw, transfer, sends is going to be needed. Now, in the case of 2 accounts, it's not going to be required for every type of transaction. So not really much validation being done there. I didn't want to put a not null because there are cases where it may be null. We may not need it. So we may not provide it. So that's why it's just sitting there in oblivion, right? So long as it's going to have a default value, we're not going to be utilizing it for all transaction related requests. Now, when it comes to, information like user, ID and stuff, we're not going to need it because we're going to utilize the JWT token for that. So any information related to user will be in the token. And that's the best approach to do, right? You don't want to provide a user ID in a request. That's not really safe. Um, but account ID is fine. We just got to make sure that we confirm that the account is related to the user that sent the request. So we'll be utilizing that to confirm if an account belongs to a user based on the JWT token, because you don't want a random person being able to withdraw money from an account that doesn't belong to them. So now that we have some models, we can utilize it to hold our data throughout the application. But before that, we're going to have to create some entities, meaning it's going to be the structure of our tables, right? Because yes, we're able to place our data into structures, but that data needs to be saved, right? So we're going to need to create some entities to create the tables that will save the data that we're holding. So let's get started on that.